Hey everybody, I'm Sasha White.
And I'm Hamza Watani, and this is The Underground.
And today is our very first episode, and we're going to be talking about the concept of white privilege. So we kind of want to discuss a little bit about the current woke meaning of white privilege and why we have some critiques with it. So to start off with, Hamza, what is your kind of impression of white privilege overall, would you say?
Oh, it's a total it's a total social control of by the upper class. I mean, they're the ones that have adopted this nonsense in mass.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at it, the way it's working out, you see corporations, you see upper class elites, such as like celebrities, and now even political elites, spewing out this nonsense, sitting and saying that we need to do the work, we need to unpack our inner racism, while saying nothing of sorts of any like issues we need to combat with, like that of poverty or any sort of substantive class issues. And in that, you don't even have to deal with, like, say, the issues of poor areas. Like where I live, Petersburg is a notoriously poor area. And
Virginia, right?
yes,
so people know it's not Petersburg, Florida.
Yes.
Or Russia.
Petersburg, Virginia is rather run down. There's almost like no money poured into this place. Even the schools have at times lost their accreditations. So I mean, you're talking about high schools that their diplomas mean nothing. And none of this talk about racism is in any way talking about how to get jobs into those types of areas. Well, if you listen to it, it's like how to open up CEO positions, how to open up executive positions. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that I noticed when I was kind of doing some research for this episode, and I was listening to some DiAngelo and some Ibram x Kendi lectures, and what I kind of understood is that white privilege has to do with not just overt racism, so like what we think of as serious discrimination or hatred or racial slurs or things like that, but it actually has to do with things that we don't even recognize as racism, like these microaggressions or these like even just not being aware enough of your whiteness. I think that's sort of an integral part of this concept of white privilege. And, Robin DiAngelo, in one of her lectures online, she begins by saying, quote, "To start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I am white." She goes on to say, "It's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it." So
it's hard not to laugh.
That, right, it is sort of funny. I mean, it's like, okay, so you thought there was no significance that anyone saw in your race. First of all, I would question that premise. I think people do see whiteness. But she's making it all about the fact that she's white, right? I mean, she's like, don't ignore that. Don't think that it's a small thing. It's the biggest thing.
The way it's framed, it's a totality. It's saying all white people, every single white person is a beneficiary of this privilege. Like I was explaining this idea to my father. My father is an Arab Iranian immigrant. And when I was explaining to him, he's like, wait, so all white people? You're telling me the guy working at the factory, busting his ass, he's got privilege? How? But here's the thing, the way that it works, it's really fine-tuned to where anyone who's not a part of that ideology will never stay in sync with it. So if you're in middle class, or if you're a worker, how the hell will you be able to keep up with this? It's just going to be, you have all these microaggressions, all these things saying that, oh, one wrong word, and this is an HR scenario. And how many people, you get canceled like that. And so, I mean, look who's the beneficiaries of this. this. I mean, that makes your workforce, it makes people highly replaceable. And the other thing is it really, what we have to do is look at what's happening in the journalist side, the what they call the professional managerial class. These guys, it's very clear that this works as like a purge of anyone who is not a liberal, a woke liberal, that you are gone. So any leftists who don't agree, and more importantly, conservatives, because this is really what it's been about. It is purging the conservatives out of almost every space. And I mean, it disproportionately, it hits the left, but much of the left has been pushed back for years. So it's not really like, what is the strength of Adolf Reed? How many people in the mainstream even know who that guy is when we say that? So it's really been about purging conservative thought from the institutions such as academia, and also purging them from like the New York Times and those sort of institutions. And the sad thing is no one's talking about that. They're talking about it in this kind of like, oh, the woke are a religion. Well, almost everything is a religion with these people. So yeah, I don't take that seriously, because you listen to any of the and I think Shant hit on this in his piece about how woke is repressive. These people who are crying foul want to make it out as if this is some sort of radical idea. No, it's repressive. It's completely repressive, because it allows white privilege and the whole white fragility argument creates a politic that you can assert social control over any form of conversation that people are having. Mm-hmm. It's more effective. I mean, it is way more effective if you think about it than any form of like nationalist rhetoric. Like if during the Iraq War, the second one, it was support the troops, but the only person who got canceled from that, or the only people who got canceled from that, were voices that you knew were going to get canceled immediately. Everything else was pretty much rock steady. I mean, Christopher Hitchens was fine. He was a big name during that time. He was pro-war. But today, wokeness it cuts across the line. It takes out people from a certain class that normally would never be on the chopping block. And I think that's why there's so much pushback, because it's actually, right now, it's actually affecting people who normally they would be able to talk and no one would really listen to them. And now just a tiny bit of speech from a sector that's a bunch of people having like 100,000 followers is enough to get journalists wanting to cancel you.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Shant Mesrobian, right? In his article, "Why Power is Getting Woke," from, I believe, his Substack, Inquire More. And yeah, this article was really important, and we both read this getting ready for this episode. And he's making this case that, it's pretty common for critics of wokeness, like we think of James Lindsay or people like that, to come at it from this liberal perspective of wokeness is this radical concept that's about destroying the power centers of the culture of America. But Sean's point is like, well, no, actually, it's really quite the opposite of that. It's actually something that's really helping power to stay entrenched and to continue on as the status quo. And he says the great awakening of America's elites is also something of a great unburdening from the responsibilities, accountability, and scrutiny that comes with power. So he thinks that the wokeness trend is kind of destroying political analysis, in the sense that all the work is meant to be on us, and we're supposed to educate ourselves and like renounce our white privilege and everything, or check our privilege. But that's the opposite of politics, where you live your life and you do whatever you want in the private sphere. And that's not really the work of the politics. The work of the politics is organizing and holding power to account, right?
Yeah. I think what's interesting is is that even as they talk about how everything's systemically racist, none of the institutional power is changing. Like, example, did you see the new CIA recruitment?
I just saw that. Yes, it was insane.
Yes, they're literally, going over the entire identity rhetoric. It's all critical race theory to the
Yeah.
max.
So if
Even
people
on,
haven't seen it, it's this recruitment ad for the CIA, and it's this woman, and she's like this 36-year-old woman, and she's like, I am a first generation Latina cisgendered woman diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. Like, she just goes through the list, right, of her privileges or her non-privileges.
all identity.
Yeah, completely obsessed with identity. And this is like fight the power, really, from the CIA.
They embraced it completely. Like every single person on the left who has ever said this is the type of politic to take them down, my God, you've just been disproven. I mean, when the CIA itself is going to use this to recruit these people, you got to know that everything that you've ever preached is just a load of horseshit. I mean,
And I wonder if, this is a little conspiracy-ish, but do you think that there's any credence to the idea that all this woke stuff actually did originate maybe from some kind of power center? And like, where did this start? I mean, we know academia, we know it started with certain theorists, critical race theory and law schools and things like that. But I mean, is there any chance that maybe this is being disseminated among the population actually from a power center like CIA to disrupt any chance of real social movements?
there's always a chance of like the COINTELPRO sort of thing because we know that's happened before. But I think if you're looking at it from its historical roots, at least the idea of like white privilege, white skin privilege, that comes into that article we were reading about the origins of that amongst the communists in America, where after the civil rights movement, when the new left was deteriorating, the the new communists that were coming in were largely middle class white people who they adopted this rhetoric of white skin privilege to purge their own ranks of working class people. So I mean, it was, and then they used the entire rhetoric of it to argue that the workers of America who have fought for all these benefits and rights, they need to give them up because now they're not oppressed, they're actually oppressors, and they need to render themselves back to the living standard that is close to that of the third world oppressed. I mean, this ideology, I would honestly think, I don't think it's more of a I don't think it is a CIA invention, more of what happens when people of a certain class adopted a type of politic that was not meant for them.
Okay.
Be-
So yeah, these young sort of college students, communists, they entered this radical movement and they decided, well, actually, this doesn't have to do with class because we don't experience that. This has to do with skin color,
yeah.
right? And what were conceived of as rights, we're now going to call them privileges if they belong to white workers.
And you got to think about it. From there, you look at where the left has really concentrated its efforts. This group has more so focused on things like race and sexuality. Like those are the two big things that they really care about. And I think that goes into, I mean, critical race theory, its roots comes from postmodernism. And I mean, a lot of postmodernism is steeped in Foucault. And that's all based in his idea of power dynamics. And I mean, this man was pretty brutal in the way he thought politics was. And by his own accord, every relation is that of power. And so critical race theory takes that and ups it a notch and says it's all group based. And it says, okay, well, then you add in now intersectionality, and you just have basically a politic of oppression where everyone who is white is deemed as like the superior people. Because there is this weird thing about critical race theory. In many ways, it posits white people in the same way white supremacy does. It's a very interesting thing that I don't understand why no one calls it out. Like the whole idea of announcing your like that you accept that you're privileged and you don't deserve this because you're so great as a white person. You know, your ancestors stole everything, and just by you saying I recognize that, that means you get to have all of it and not have to worry about it. Because there's an interesting exchange between Lee Fang from The Intercept and Ryan Grimm of The Intercept when the two got into the argument about white privilege. Lee Fang, the Asian American, was rebuking that concept, telling Ryan Grimm, if he feels so strongly about it, why doesn't he give up his position in The Intercept to a person of color or a minority? And Ryan Grimm immediately was like, oh, it's not about me. I earned my stuff, through hard work and effort. It's like, but I do recognize my privilege. So, and by saying that, he's absolved. Mm-hmm. So yeah. He doesn't have to play the same game.
So, but then ironically, there have also been cases where people supposedly gave up their spots because they were white or because they were not BIPOC and LGBTQ plus. I mean, I just was reading about a case of this academic named Callie Burt, and she's an associate professor at, I think, Georgia State University of Criminology. And she was kicked off of an editorial board that she was serving on of a journal, like a feminist criminology journal. And then she was accused of transphobia because she wrote an article critiquing the Equality Act. And she was kicked off this board. And they basically had this kind of like witch hunt thing where they decided that if you were not BIPOC or LGBTQ plus, that you shouldn't be on this board. And a number of people resigned because they weren't in those categories. I mean, people are actually like either really or performatively taking up the mantle of like actually disposing themselves from these positions because of their identity.
Well, I'm not going to cry for them. I'm going to say that. I don't mind if they go and render themselves into poverty. I'd say thank you. We need less of them, not more. So on that, I guess that is positive in that way because they
just get rid of them.
Yeah, they purge themselves. Too bad.
But I also feel like, just as a joke, it was just an excuse to leave. Like, I knew a guy who was actually a former coworker of mine who ended up throwing me under the bus when I was canceled and fired, and he sort of like apologized for my offensive comments. But he had, a few months prior to my being fired, he was supposed to be on some panel, and then he said that he didn't do it because he felt there weren't enough trans people of color on the panel. And so as a white cis man, he decided not to serve on the panel. But my joke was like, he was just busy that day, and so he couldn't do it. And he just said that was why he didn't do it, in order to gain street cred among the woke.
Oh, of course. This politic gives the people who embrace it so many real like social privileges. Because one, it gives them social control. I mean, just having your pronouns when you're talking to somebody, you can immediately throw it in their face, make them say your pronouns. And then if they misgender you, you get to call them out. I mean, this is like a politic of abusive people. I mean, it really is. But the thing is, I can't see that working too well. I can see that working well in the middle and upper class, because those people, you check privilege, they'll apologize. I don't see that working well when you go lower and lower, because the dynamic doesn't work the same way. You call somebody out, they may go, yeah, what are you going to do about it? Then what? But it does work well online, because like the TRAs, great example, those little munchkins.
Trans rights activists, if you're listening and you're not part of that world.
Yes, the trans rights activists, they love to use these situations to hold people accountable. Like you have woke people, they'll talk about accountability. And it's really interesting because you're here, you can hear the glee. Like you can really see the glee when they type out like this person should be held accountable because they're taking pleasure out of this. This is their chance to actually be able to use this abusive form of ideology to go after people's lives without any repercussions. And I mean, just on that alone, that should really cause a society to question whether things have gone way too far on this, because like that that can't keep going on forever. There's going to be someone who he gets canceled and then he finds out who canceled him, and it's going to be a bloodbath.
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's something we would hope for or if that would just make everything worse.
Well, we live in a country where guns are easy to get. So, I mean, people should really think about what they're doing, because we've so far seen cancel culture really destroy people on the left and in the liberal side. It really hasn't hit the conservative side because they live in conservative areas. Good luck canceling them, you know? So, I mean, you're not going to get somebody who's living in Mobile, Alabama canceled. It's not going to happen. But
although on the other hand, I have seen it happen because of the internet. You know, you're right. It wouldn't be within their communities, but there was this woman. I always tell her story because it's one of the worst cancellation stories. But Tabitha Morris, she's from Kentucky, and she's a really hardcore conservative, right-winger Trump supporter. And she was canceled because she made a video about the Black Lives Matter movement, and she said she doesn't support it, and she said, "You can kiss my white ass." And they absolutely went after her. I mean, they created a campaign against her, these people who sort of lie in wait on the internet for someone to step out of line, and that's what they're there for. Like,
where
there's
does
these
she work
pages.
at?
She worked at a hospital. And
Okay,
I don't remember her exact position, but what her story was that I interviewed her on my channel. She had worked her way up over 20 years. She hadn't gone to college, and she had achieved this pretty good salary that she basically only got because she worked her way up over all those years. And she got fired. She hasn't been able to find a new job because other hospitals in her area know and they don't want to touch it. She hasn't been able to get a lawyer for the same reason, political. They've even told her outright, we don't agree with you and we won't support you and defend you. And she's had like death and rape threats even to her children, to her daughters.
Yeah. This is I can see that because the hospitals are like the colleges. That ideology is all throughout the institutions of that nature. If you're working for some local company, probably not. If it's owned by some conservative guy, he'll probably brush it off. He'll say, it's my property, my employee, I decide. But when you have like a hospital or a university, no way, you're done.
Well, and I think part of the problem is also that the internet mob can come for the employer. So yeah, you would hope like a conservative boss might just say, you know, screw that. I'm not going to listen to this mob. I don't care. I don't think they've done something fireable. But because they don't really have any authority to say no to the mob can just come after their business. I mean, so this woman, Tabitha Morris, she's now campaigning to end at-will employment, because at-will employment means you can just be fired anytime for any reason. Yeah. So if we had some kind of protection, then maybe the boss would be less likely to just throw us to the mob. You know, they could actually say to the mob, well, it's illegal for me to fire them. So, I mean, this really brings us back to the issue of working class versus racial privilege politics, right? Because how we're kind of talking about the privilege politics is that it obscures class politics, and
you're not talking
really
about
just
this.
denies it completely, right?
Yeah, you're not talking about any of this stuff. So when with class privilege, all you're with all these white privilege arguments, all you're talking about is racism. That's it. That is the sin of the country. And so what you're really saying is all the poor people are poor, they deserve it. But through white privilege, we're allowing black people to, rise up. Now the ones that fall, that's it. They're done. Under that politic, you don't have to care about them because we've eliminated racism, or we're working on eliminating racism. But there is an interesting thing. How can you ever eliminate racism under like the Ibram X Kendi argument? No one is going to be a non-racist. It's impossible. So
You can't, if you, he actually says non-racists are racists in denial.
yeah, and in that case, all that means is he's got a job for life. That's what that means. Because the other thing to think about this is all the people who are peddling this stuff, all of them are basically consultants.
Like Ron and
And
DiAngelo.
exactly. So all these people are creating a new market that they are always going to be in demand because that the way that the whole white privilege argument works, there's no way of ever accomplishing the goal. So I mean, this everything in this country has some sort of profit motive in it. That's the scary thing about it. But for class aspect, I mean, how can you talk about workers' rights? The minute you try to talk about that, you immediately get into like the Joyanne Reed argument against was it Medicare for all? Medicare for all won't solve the problems of black people, she argued. They need a racial reckoning. Now, for her, that's easy to say. She's an MSNBC anchor, or was it a pundit, and she makes a load of money. She doesn't have any issues with Medicare, and the people she knows doesn't have any issues with Medicare. So, I mean, when you're looking at this politic, it really makes it impossible to talk about class in any form. And that just entrenches the power of the upper class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so in this other article by Candace Cohen, a Marxist critique of the theory of white privilege, she writes that since the 1970s, white male workers with no more than a high school education have seen their wages drop by a third. So it's not like they are seeing this massive amount of privilege and material privilege. You know what I mean? Maybe they have some privileges like that Robin DiAngelo talks about, like maybe you're not going to be insulted based off the color of your skin in so many situations as a black person would. There are white privileges. That's true for sure. But to say that these workers are complicit in a system of racism is just, it's like glossing over the fact that they still need to gain more material rights and better working conditions. And that really, I mean, if you look at a classic like leftist or Marxist analysis, they can only do that by banding together with the black workers and with the workers of all races. If they're divided, they can have no hope of achieving those gains.
Well, I mean, why wouldn't this politic be embraced by those people for that reason? I mean, it works so well against the society in terms of being able to have any form of workers conversation, any form of social program to help people. I mean, think about it. You have the Rust Belt, you have this mass amount of people who are dying of overdosing because the Rust Belt is a devastated workers based area of the country. It's this region of states which were heavily based on auto manufacturing or some form of manufacturing. And it's just people are losing their jobs. They're having to go get jobs that are paying vastly less money. And they're going into despair. What's the conversation about it? Oh, how do we deal with the drug overdose? Well, if all you're thinking about is just, oh, the drug overdose is the problem. No, the problem isn't the fact that these people are losing jobs. Well, concentrating on that allows you to obfuscate the real issue. But then here comes in critical race theory. That just completely annihilates that conversation even more. Because why would you concentrate on an issue that's happening to white people? That's just more forms of racism. Because look, what about all these other minorities and whatnot? And think about this. When the average person starts hearing this, they don't sit there and think, oh, they're doing this just to antagonize. They think this is an anti-white racist thing, and these minorities, they're working against us. That's what you hear on the right. And the right plays to that. And like, have you heard of the great replacement theory?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, that it's about immigration, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. That immigrants will come and become the majority of the country, and whites will be replaced, essentially.
Yes. I wish that they would read a book by Alvin Toffler called Future Shock, because in Future Shock, he talked about what was called the information age, which is what we've actually entered into, which is that the elites of the country are going to want a highly mobile working force. It's because if they're highly mobile, you can pay them less. You can allow wages to depress in the area. You don't have to care about the populace that's living there, because that populace has to get off its ass and go to wherever the work is needed. That's how they're thinking it, how it's supposed to be. And you can already see that happening in the EU, how they made this whole system to where people can move from one place to another. And so for people who, unfortunately, on the right, because the right has to also defend this while they're critiquing this, they're going to play that as a race game. Oh, they're trying to destroy our culture. All the time, they're actually enacting policies that enhance this issue, or not going to even deal with the issue. You do have some, like the Brexit movement, that was attempting to deal with that issue, but it was itself not honest. Do you know what I mean? It's in and of itself, it was still just about protecting of local industries and just finding new ways of impoverishing those at the bottom as well.
So is this in a way identity politics from the right and playing on more white racial fears about their own identity? Would you consider that identity politics from the other side?
The right uses culture politics to obfuscate their own economic policies that are doing the same thing as the neoliberals, because the right is heavily neoliberal. So they're enacting policies like all these privatization policies, and they're telling their populace, this is good, this is all for you, it's all freedom and all this, and they'll protect our culture. Well, all of what we're experiencing now with this mass amount of censorship is due to privatization. It's due to allowing Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, all these tech companies to build up immense power with no sort of regulatory office to overlook and make sure they're not discriminating on speech. I mean,
yeah, and Candace Cohen, the author that we were talking about, she basically says that the white privilege theory kind of almost echoes austerity rhetoric, because it's saying that whites should give up these undeserved, unearned privileges, and that, essentially these reforms that were won through class struggle are undeserved privileges if they're belonging to white workers. Yeah. So it's very similar to austerity in that it's not about the ruling class giving more or stimulating the economy or anything like that. It's about the workers should press themselves and have less and less and less.
Yeah, it's all about the populace changing themselves while the government changes nothing. So that's why the idea that this is revolutionary or radical is absurd. It is completely a repressive politic that's meant to entrench the people in power even more.
And it keeps us always focused on race, right? I mean, like we started with that Robin DiAngelo quote about how she's had to work for many, many years to draw attention to that her whiteness and the significance of it. And she also said in the same lecture something that I thought was very revealing and strange. She said, I'll read the quote so that I can't be accused of taking her out of context. She said, here in the physical realm, she's talking about like, she basically said, yeah, in the spiritual realm, we're all one and the same, but we don't live in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences because racism is real. Now, what does that remind you of? Bleed under the skin. We all bleed under the skin. That's from Shylock by Shakespeare, the play about the Jew and the pound of flesh, you know, and the famous speech from Shylock. And I got it here. Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you poison us, do we not die? That's like the classic, we're all human, we're all the same, no matter what ethno, nationality, or religion or race we're from. And she's basically saying, no, ignore that. That's an ideal that we can't live up to. That's actually perpetuating racism, and we should focus on the fundamental differences, and we shouldn't talk about how we all bleed under the skin.
Yeah, it is nothing more than a repackaging of a form of white supremacy, because they also look at it, who's leading these movements, even though they talk about POCs, even if they, and let's talk about that term, person of color. I just want to say this. If we don't accept the term colored people, why are we accepting a term that's flipped and added the word of? I mean, I don't know. It's just ridiculous to me.
Yeah.
But anyway, you don't see any of the, like, you see the Ibram X Kendi, that type of individual being kind of like the new priest, you know, coming in, and he's the guy who's going to, you know, absolve you of your sins by making you confess. Yeah. And he's actually talked about confession. So
he said the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. That's a quote.
So I mean, this guy's really fashioned himself as a priest. But I mean, this really reminds me of, have you ever read White Man's Burden?
No.
Okay, so White Man's Burden is what it was, let me bring it out here. White Man's Burden. Yeah,
you've said before this reminds you of the White Man's Burden and kind of the white savior complex. Is that similar?
Yeah, well, what it was when America began to go and colonize, like the Philippines and all that, it didn't sit there and say, hey, we're going to take over these people and take their land. They said, we white men, we have a burden upon us. We must go and civilize these people, bring them up, because these people are not as good as us. So we've got to go to them and bring them civilization. Okay, and if you listen to white privilege, the superior white person, you know, the white person who Black people cannot rise because I am in this position, this undeserved position. If I announce my privilege, then I can help these people by admitting that I am undeserved of my privileges. Like, it's absolutely absurd, but it's a very effective way of doing nothing. Mm-hmm. It really goes back to how identity politics is completely an anti-politic, in that it prevents any real form of substantive politics at all, because all you're locked to is this worthless culture war that's actually very devastating to the lives of everyone that's not in their little bubble. And those people that are in those bubbles can be kicked out too. So they're terrified of going against the grain. So, I mean, again, entrenchment of power. That's all this is. It is literally the white liberal finding out a politic that solidifies their status in society. And it gets worse every month.
Do you think this is going to keep getting worse?
Yes. I don't like a lot of people think that they're going to beat this back, and it could like you could get a red tide that really does damage to the Democrats, and maybe get some sort of well, no, I don't think the Democrats could ever um do any form of introspection. They will never do that. So what you'll probably have is this double down where they will make every single conservative a Trumpian figure and try to make him like the new Hitler. And that because that's all they know what to do. They're not going to give it up. They've never given up anything that they get.
And I mean, we see right now, we see Biden getting all this credit from quote unquote progressive politicians like the Squad, AOC. She gave him, a great score so far because why? Because he's done these identitarian woke policies. Like he signed into, these executive orders about LGBT and things like that.
Largely LGBT.
Yeah, it's largely that. And it's other things too. It's like sort of surface level things. I mean, he's claiming that he's ending the war in Afghanistan. We're going to get into that in later episodes. Of course, we've still got contractors there, and it's not quite so simple, but he's getting all this credit for it, right? So it is sort of boosting his status somehow, where otherwise it's like, how could he have possibly gained any recognition? He's this bumbling fool. How could he have gained any credit?
Yeah. Well, where do you start with Biden? I mean, with Biden, he has literally lucked into a adoring journalist, adoring media that's going to pump him up no matter what. Okay, he has done largely, topical, nothing great. $15 an hour, throw that out the window. That's not going to happen. Let's see, what's some other stuff that he's doing that is a shame. Oh, the detention centers.
Mm-hmm.
Think about this. All through 2016, you had this like rage over these horrible detention centers. They even talked about it as like it was genocide. Now they're doing the same thing and no one's talking about it at all.
Yeah.
AOC, the Squad. How do we take these people seriously? I mean, you had the Force the Vote, where they refused to force the vote on a Medicare for all. You had them talk about how they're going to get $15 an hour wage. Well, that's never going to happen, as we see. The Democrats have basically taken that off the table. So, I mean, where's the progressive politics here? Other than just, a few rights and taking away girl sports. I mean, that's basically the progressive politics right there.
Yep.
I already have neighbors who are taking their kids out of school because the VDOE, which is Virginia Department of Education, wants to push in gender specialists into our schools. Okay. How many of these conservatives are going to take this? This guy's already, I've got one who's already said he's going to get his kid in Christian school. I mean, the conservatives can run with this because this is a dream come true. They've been wanting to get at the public educational system forever. I mean, they've been wanting to tear that down with vouchers and all that. Now you have a system where critical race theory is going to be pumped and queer theory is going to be pumped into the schools. How many people are going to scream for privatization of schools as the answer to that, even though that's not even a guarantee? I mean,
even I could see it coming from the other side too, the liberal or neoliberal calling for privatization of schools and saying that, public schools aren't serving underserved populations well enough. They're not
Yeah,
serving marginalized populations, and that they should be privatized.
yeah. I mean, you now have a situation where both wings can argue for privatization. And what do you think that's going to do to everyone who can't afford these schools?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, that's why I keep on saying I think it's going to just get worse. I can't see it getting better, because in America, the impetus is that everyone votes based on their team. They don't vote on the policy. You know, a Republican will vote for Republican. A Democrat will vote for Democrat. And that's going to get worse because now, if you look at it, CNN, MSNBC, and even ABC and NBC and CBS, all of them are largely watched by Democrats. Okay. It's causing a situation where the news is becoming so partisan that, you know, people are going to only know their issues and refuse to learn the other side, because that's also about white privilege. You're not supposed to read the other side. You've already said all of them are deviant monsters, so you don't read, what Fox News and New York Post has to say, because they're racist and they're not good, and because of that you can just ignore them. So I mean, you're going to have this populace that's going to be very ideological, and that is not what you want. And also, the other side of that coin is how insane woke politics becomes, allows the conservative side's politics to become even more insane. So I mean, where are we going?
Yeah, well, nowhere good, it looks like. I mean, I think it's safe to say that the Democrats, the Republicans, it's almost like they have similar interests here, and they get to continue on with everything the way it is. They can continue having corporate control over government and sort of this revolving door policy that we know about, where politicians and corporate entities are all benefiting from each other and making laws that benefit them. And meanwhile, like you said, the populace is going to become more polarized on this like ideological level, while things just get worse. We don't get Medicare, we don't get other public services that we need. And meanwhile, the ruling class is just going to laugh all the way to the bank.
Yeah, and think about the other aspect of it. So you have this increased ideological bent on both sides, and then you have a fight on the conservative side, because you have a rising social conservatives through, like, say, Sagar and Jetty, Tucker Carlson, Matt Walsh, and those guys, they do represent a little bit of a difference because they are more willing to look at social programs. But on the establishment end, they can sit there and do the same. They could do kind of like a reverse, where they're campaigning to get rid of critical race theory, but not really going after it. It's sort of like a quid pro quo sort of deal, where it's reciprocal. They do something, we do something back, and nothing changes at all. That is what's so devastating about woke politics. It creates an excuse for all sides to do nothing of value for the people. It's sad. For the left, this is very sad, because I don't think any form of populism can come from the left, because where are you going to go through? If you're going through the Democratic primaries, you're done. They're gonna beat you over the head with woke nonsense, because that stuff works very effective on punching left. I mean, you saw it with Bernie Sanders. All they did in the first run was sit there and hammer this guy, that he's not talking to black people, that he is too much a Bernie bro white politic. And so next go around, he adopted the woke ideology, and that completely turned off half his base.
Mm.
And he was done by, I mean, he was crushed like a bug in the last primaries. Anyone else coming through, I don't see them doing well at all. not through the primary system, because once they start hitting the South, that the primary votes normally go for establishment. They never go for the outsider Democrat. So I don't see any. And who are you going to get? The progressive Democrats are all in the same boat as the establishment. I mean, AOC has been. McCarthy was right. Sean P. McCarthy, he was right when he said that AOC was devastating to the left. It has been. She has thoroughly discredited us. Like, where does the left go after woke politics? Has got to be a question, because that is a major problem.
I think that's a good question to end with. And
Yeah.
thank you everyone for tuning in to our first episode. We hope you enjoyed it. And we have new episodes every Wednesday. If there's a topic or question you want us to cover, just leave a comment below. And we'll see you next Wednesday.